Hi everyone. I am delighted to be here with Magdalena Schmierschik. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Magdalena. and a lot of you will recognise Magdalena from the Emerging Proud film. So we just thought it would be really wonderful to reconnect and find out what's been happening with you, Magdalena, in the last year. And I'm just really honoured to kind of be connected to you. And, so many people say to me, we need to be doing more for this campaign. We need to be affecting, like you said in the film, we need to be influencing government and policy. And, I don't know the first thing around human rights, even though kind of when I set out to do this, I saw it as a human rights movement. So if people don't already know, you are a human rights lawyer and have your own passion around developing the human right for altered states of consciousness. And I know you presented on that at the Transpersonal Conference in Prague last year. So it would be great to touch on that a little bit maybe, and just let people know that, things are happening in the world. Even though the Emerging Proud campaign itself might not be doing that, we are connected to people like you who have your own kind of mission and passions around that, which I'm just so thrilled about. So I wonder if we could just maybe start with a bit, for those who might not know about your story, where your passion came from for this, Magdalena. Okay.
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, I had my own big spiritual awakening that was very dramatic. It was a psycho-spiritual crisis at the time, and I was basically thrown into, let's say, the mental health system. But also, this is an issue that I've had to deal with because it's in my family. And going through that process awakened me not only to the experience, but to how the spiritual emergency is handled, or just how mental health crises are handled generally. And once I was able to come out of that, and of course there's a process of integration, and well, what do I do? What is my purpose here? How do I contribute? And slowly those pieces started coming together. And as you said, I am a human rights specialist. That's what I've been doing my entire life, what I've been studying. I've been an advocate of human rights. And it became clear that there are these connections with the work that I had been doing up until that point, and continue to do. So it's not just mental health and human rights that I focus on. I focus it on more broadly, which is the topic that I spoke about at the Transpersonal Conference, sort of like the broader vision for human rights and the evolution of human rights, and where are we going, what does this all mean? And I came up with a proposal for a human right to expanded consciousness, and really relating just everything that I know about human rights to human evolution, in a way, to the evolution of human consciousness, and trying to see how all those things go together. So yeah, it's been quite a path. And it was in fact last year in London at the Emerging Proud conference that I had the inspiration to submit for the Transpersonal Conference an abstract. The very next day was the deadline. And so after the types of conversations that we had Emerging Proud in London, and there was just so much inspiration, so many stories. And something that I said at the conference in the presentation is that human rights issues came up. I wasn't the one bringing it up. I'm coming into that conference with a human rights oriented mindset, but it was the participants that were saying, well, like, wait a minute, this is my dignity that's at stake, and this is potentially a violation of my rights. So I synthesize those conversations, and that's what I've been building on since then. Yeah.
Wow, I'm getting shivers, because it's like, we were talking a bit before we started to record, and I was saying, I don't know the first thing around how to develop a new human right, but what I can do is connect with people who have lots of knowledge that I don't have. And that's what I'm loving about this evolution. It's all about us coming together and collaborating and bringing, like you said, when we wake up, we kind of bring to that our personal mission of the things that we've been working on kind of previously in our lives. And that seems to be the beauty of this, and I'm hearing that just more and more. So yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to that a bit more, or
Well, it was actually our conversation last year when we did this little interview, and you had asked me, you said, well, doesn't the Human Rights Act have the right, the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion? You asked me about it, and I hesitated a little bit because I thought, yes, that's not applicable. I don't even know how to relate to that. And I started talking about mental disability. And then it was after that conversation, I thought, that's a really good point. Yes, the UK Human Rights Act has the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. The European Convention on Human Rights, and of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has that right. It's a fundamental human right. So it was really our conversation last year that made me research it a little bit further and look into whether the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion had been applied to cases of mental crisis, a spiritual emergency, and whether that had been defended in the court cases, whether there has been any literature and scholarship about it. And really there wasn't. And I think that's when I started to think beyond what already exists. Well, if these rights exist, but they haven't been applied to situations such as a spiritual emergency or mental health crisis, then maybe we can add more layers of meaning to human rights, which ultimately is what they're intended to do. So that's where sort of the creativity kicked in, and thinking of how human rights can be applied to this. And there isn't a whole lot of room for creativity in human rights work or legal work, because you're supposed to, I mean, the entire purpose of a law is to apply what has been, what has worked, in order to make sure that it's applicable for everybody. And so this was a new way of thinking about these rights, and also using the terminology and the language from the transpersonal community. So I had done a little bit of research of, what are the transpersonal principles? Are they using a human rights language? And in fact, they are already. So the idea of that presentations, and generally what I'm thinking about, is how transpersonal psychology and human rights can go together, can intersect. And there isn't a clear answer to that. I think it's a conversation. So I think my purpose right now is just to explore those ideas, bring the human rights language, and see what we come up with. That was what happened at the Emerging Prague conference last year. Certainly at the Transpersonal conference in Prague, I was challenged. It's not that it was an automatic, embracing of these new concepts. We have to really think them through and see if they're applicable.
Sure. I'm just thinking how it relates as well. Like you're saying, and things happen in conversation, don't they? When people come together, momentum happens. That's what's happening with the campaign. I was just thinking what you were saying in relation to human evolution and where things are going, just in medicine in general, and there's more openness to using psychedelic drugs for psychotherapeutic benefit. So, we're going to need to be able to accept altered states of consciousness being induced for that. So if it's accepted, more widely accepted, which it seems that it's likely to be because the outcomes are looking really positive. So, it just feels like maybe there is a shift, and we're tapping into something around where these things are going, and thinking about, the history. And I wanted this campaign to be built on the back of like the Black rights movement, the gay rights movement. Just feels like there's another rights movement really building here around this, stigma of mental health, and but like you were saying, kind of the bigger umbrella of that, really.
Right. And the umbrella that I decided to discuss was expanded consciousness, because I saw the spiritual emergence, or if you call it a mental health crisis, it has different types of definitions on the one hand, and then altered states of consciousness through psychedelic use that also are used for healing, for exploring consciousness, but are severely punished. And I wanted to bring those two things together because transpersonal psychology brings those two things together, and they both involve human rights issues, but they're not very often discussed in the same conversation. And so that's part of the idea behind it, is, you know, can we bridge those two issues as human rights issues? That's ultimately, we're talking about altered states of consciousness, we're talking about denials of freedom, substances, whether, you know, in psychedelic use you choose to put in substances for an altered states of consciousness, as opposed to being in an altered state and not wanting any substances. Forced treatments. So there's these types of dichotomies in how issues are being looked at, that I see a clear interconnection, and something that needs to be discussed further and thought about.
And it's just wonderful to hear that you're kind of initiating these conversations with that language. It's so necessary. And I was just thinking as well, it's like the in-between, isn't there? Because there's inducing altered states of consciousness through breath work, which is becoming more popular as well, and not using substances, but, you know, also that can if that induces an altered state of consciousness, which then goes too far, you know, there's so many complexities involved in this subject, isn't there?
That's right. And there's a lot of questions about what are the actual mechanics, what is happening in that altered states of consciousness, and whether it's I mean, even in holotropic breathwork, as you were saying, you can induce a crisis potentially, right? And that's seen as very different than psychedelic use. So I mean, generally, just those things are connected.
Yeah, it's just crossed my mind actually when you saying that around, you know, people might be saying, what's the point? You know, why is this so important? And it's, to me, I don't know, this is, I suppose, a question to you. It's around creating more safety mechanisms around this kind of stuff, because if it's legal and acceptable, then we can, you know, we can regulate it. We can have more safety mechanisms in place. Whereas at the moment that doesn't exist. Would you say that that's kind of the motive for you too?
Absolutely, definitely. I think it's generally how we treat expanded state of consciousness, and whether it's something that we see as acceptable, whether it's something within the societies that we want to embrace, that we think has a healing potential, which we know it does. We know that a spiritual emergence is part of a healing process. An expanded state of consciousness through psychedelic use can be part of a healing process, or not, or it can just be an altered state of consciousness, period. It doesn't have to have a healing purpose, a therapeutic purpose. It doesn't have to have a spiritual or religious purpose. It's just something that belongs to us because we are human. And both in the mental health crisis treatment, it can be prohibited, and through the use of psychedelics, it can be prohibited. And that's really unfortunate, because this is, I think, what we're trying to do in the process of evolution, is push those boundaries and see how far our consciousness can go.
And also I just, the research is saying, isn't it, that when those altered states are stopped, that's halting the healing process. So that's counterproductive as well. So you know, when we're talking about holding someone safely so that they can go through their process in a safer way,
Right.
then yeah, it's all around safety for me, I suppose. I wonder, Magdalena, how, you know, I don't know the first thing about how to develop a human right. What would the stages be if this were to kind of, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot a bit here, but I'm just wondering, kind of, you know, what else could we do other than having conversations around it and raising awareness? What would need to be done?
Well, what I realized after the presentation in Prague is that not everyone can very easily connect those two things, a spiritual emergency and a psychedelic experience, because not everybody has had those kind of experiences. And so I guess I can only speak from personal experience that in my experience, those things connect. And I'm not sure that one can get a full comprehension of it without the experience of it. So we can raise awareness, we can talk about it as a human rights issues in relation to what people can already relate to. And I think that's why these more traditional human rights are the types of language that we will have to continue talking about rather than creating a new right for now, because it's very difficult for people to connect to a concept of expanded consciousness without pushing those boundaries and without going into those states themselves. So at this point, I think it's a conversation within certain communities, within the personal community, within the psychedelic community, and in relation to talking about spiritual emergency, not necessarily broadly when we, you know, get into mental health and human rights, or drug use and human rights. Those things are still very, very separate, and they connect through people, through the conversations that people need to have. And therefore, in that process, the language will change, and the concepts will change, and the conversations will change. And that's sort of what I was trying to say at the conference, that it's very much about meaning, about language, about experience, and how we connect to that. And that's all human rights are. I mean, human rights are ultimately concepts. They're just ideas about what we think is good, what we think is valuable, what we think is fair and dignified and equal. And unless we can connect to that collectively, then, you know, they're just kind of concepts in the air. So right to expanded consciousness can just be an idea that I'm throwing out there, and really won't have effect unless people are embracing it and saying, actually, that's really useful for me.
It's always about bridging the gaps, isn't it? It's like there's one kind of group of thinking over here and another over here, and as we connect more and have more experiences and more conversations, those things kind of just, I suppose, naturally come together. So would you say that just carrying on what we're doing and collecting the evidence that shows that, you know, it's actually really helpful for people to be able to freely have these experiences and be supported in a safe way to navigate through them, as opposed to, you know, the current treatment as usual mental health system, for example, just by collating that evidence is kind of movement and momentum enough at the moment to help those conversations move in the right direction?
I think, and this is what we said last year when we were having our conversation, is that it never moves fast enough. Right?
Yeah.
We want things to move faster. So when we're talking about human rights issues, from my perspective, and I think from yours, a human rights is an emergency situation. Like, we need it now. So to wait for that language to evolve, and it's not the best case scenario. So I think the current situation that we have now is that there is a movement that addresses mental health and human rights. It's looking at it through the mental disability, through the disability rights, through the different programs and reports that are coming through the UN system, through the Human Rights Act, and through the human rights conventions and in different parts of the world. And then then there is some advocacy concerning human rights and psychedelic use when it comes to religious purposes, therapeutic purposes. Cognitive liberty is a concept that has come up that relates to the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So it's not like a new human right, it's still trying to relate it to the traditional set of human rights. So those conversations already exist, and they exist in parallel. And I think what's ultimately going to happen is that the different healing, these experiences are going to be seen as healing methods. So psychedelics as healing tools, or the process of spiritual emergence as healing, and it's going to be seen more and more as something positive, something that we should embrace. And if we should embrace it, there should be policies and programs and support to ensure that that happens. So that's another thing that I talked about in the presentation, is this idea of a positive obligation, of a positive right, that creating systems and environments and policies that give everybody an access to these different healing methods. So it's these, like I said, these things work in parallel. There is advocacy both in mental health and human rights related to psychedelic use. And I think as they move forward, they will start to converge. And in that process, if we can contribute the language and then understanding and raising awareness, then I'm hopeful that it will just, continue to happen naturally, not fast enough.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's, it's so true, isn't it? When, most of us working in this field have got personal reasons why we are so passionate about it. So it's hard to just let go and sit back and let it evolve in its own time, because it's painful to watch people that you love that are, being hurt and damaged by the current systems. But like what I've realized more and more, it's just that letting go is such an important part of the journey. And I think, it's reassuring to hear you say what you've just said, because sometimes I feel like, oh gosh, I should be doing more. What more could I be doing, and what more could the campaign be doing? And people say that as well, and it's like, well, I'm only a tiny piece of the puzzle, as we all are. So like you just said, there are so many people working in these other fields doing their bits too, and eventually all of these puzzle pieces will come together. So if we are, doing the best we can with our own piece of the puzzle, then that's enough, and I think,
But I think also educating ourselves about human rights.
Okay. Yeah.
That's something that I was really encouraged by at the conference in London last year, is how much people knew about human rights. They knew their rights. They knew there was something wrong. They were able to go and do the research, and they knew, for example, about legal capacity. When legal capacity is taken away when you're hospitalized and you're not able to make certain decisions about your own treatment. I mean, people knew that. They knew, frankly, more than I did at the time. A conversation that we had on Emerging Proud on the website about advanced directives.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. I knew a little bit about it, but not enough until that conversation started, and I started researching it intensely. And now, not only do I feel like I know a fair bit about it, but I'm teaching it to my students.
Amazing.
Who are able to carry it forward. So we are doing it, and it does, as you're saying, it feels like it's a little tiny piece of the puzzle, but that it's, yeah, we're making those connections by carrying the information forward and also absorbing what other people are telling us, right? So like I'm saying, a lot of these things in the last 1 year I was not very familiar with, even though I consider myself a very informed about human rights. I did not know enough about this until the conference in London, until some of the emerging proud conversations, until the transpersonal conference, when we had that kind of dialogue. So, it's just that's the process.
It is, and it's all about collective wisdom, isn't it? That's what I love. It's like, and it takes the pressure off, none of us have to know everything. We all just need to know a little bit and come together and share. Yeah, you're so right. Thank you so much for coming back and updating. And I don't know if you want to share a bit about what you've been doing in the last year and where you're at now. And
yeah, well, hello from the Holy Land.
yeah.
I've been in Jerusalem for the last couple of months. I've been teaching and researching on human rights issues here, and this will continue. I continue this summer. I will be at the Integral European Conference, so that's where we met. That conversation will continue. It's the topic that I will be presenting is on the human consciousness and the integral evolution of human rights. So the same idea about how human rights have evolved and how we connect these different sources of knowledge to what we think of as human rights, and what do we do with that. So yeah, it's a continual progression, and yeah, I'm very excited that we built on so much, and you've built on so much since the last year that all this has started. It's really grown, hasn't it?
It's really grown, and it's just, I'm so overjoyed to be connected and hear you talking about this and how you're traveling the world and talking about this. It's just, yeah, it's mind-blowing, to be honest, how much this has grown, and the people that I'm connected to. It's amazing. I've got so much respect for the work you're doing, and yeah, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. Yeah, and I don't know, it feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? It's like the Imagine Proud campaign, the day last year. It feels like so much has happened since then. It's only a year. It's incredible.
Absolutely. Yeah, but we're moving forward, and as I was last year, and I continue to be very much empowered by the strength of the movement.
Bless you, and thank you so much for taking it around the world and spreading the message. And giving hope, to people who are feeling that they have no rights and dignity, that there are conversations happening around that. And I think that's a really important message that I wanted to give people today from your interview. It's like, when people ask, I might not be able to do that work, but people are doing it. People like you who are in the field, you have links to the UN, we're talking at that kind of level. So, things are happening. So yeah, there's hope everywhere.
It's a global movement.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us, Magdalena.
Thanks, Phoebe.
I'm really excited to see where things evolve if in the next year. I'm sure we'll see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Bye.